And so we literally came back from school, climbed on our ponies, and we lived just under the downs. So we used to get on our ponies.
Princess Charlotte stepped into the spotlight at the Royal Charity Gala, where glittering gowns and polished speeches were the norm. Yet, in that grand hall, her calm but commanding presence broke through the evening's routine. With words far wiser than her years, she stirred an emotion so raw it left Queen Camilla momentarily speechless. Guests sat frozen, caught between admiration and disbelief. What could spark such silence from a single speech? Stay tuned as we uncover the moment that changed the night forever. A name that stopped the room. The Royal Charity Gala at St. James's Palace had always been an event carved in precision. Crystal glasses aligned like soldiers, embroidered linens smoothed to perfection, and chandeliers casting golden pools of light across the marble floor. Every guest knew the rhythm, speeches polished to shine, laughter fluttering politely between conversations about art and charity, and the reassuring hum of tradition. It was the kind of night where even surprises felt rehearsed. Yet somewhere between the quiet rustle of gowns and the polished chime of cutlery, a shift began. Small, but enough to still the air. The master of ceremonies approached the microphone, his voice steady but carrying an edge that hinted at something unscripted. Then it came, a brief address from Her Royal Highness, Princess Charlotte of Wales. The effect was instant. Wine glasses froze mid-air. Camera crews adjusted with a sudden urgency. Queen Camilla's gaze sharpened, and King Charles leaned forward with quiet curiosity. Across the head table, Catherine's hand brushed her daughter's back in a gesture of steady approval, while William's eyes revealed both pride and a trace of caution. Charlotte rose without hesitation. Her gown, a pale blue silk that caught the light like frost, whispered as she moved. There was no nervous shuffle, no hurried step, only the measured grace of someone stepping into a moment they had already claimed in their mind. The orchestra's soft notes faded into silence. Even the subtle murmur of the crowd seemed to collapse into stillness. She had asked to speak earlier that afternoon, calmly, firmly, explaining her wish in private to her mother. No media leaks, no public rehearsal, just a request from the heart. The palace staff had quietly altered the evening's program, careful not to spark early headlines. Now, under the weight of every eye in the room, she reached the podium. Both hands rested lightly on its edge. She let the quiet settle, her gaze sweeping over diplomats, charity leaders, her family, and rows of expectant faces. There was nothing stiff in her stance, no trace of the awkwardness often forgiven in the young. She looked, in that moment, entirely at home. And then she began not with formalities, but with a story. One about unnoticed kindness, the quiet power of service, and the lives touched by acts too small for headlines, but large enough to change the world. Her voice was gentle, yet steady, carrying a thread of steel that made even seasoned reporters lean forward. In the front row, Queen Camilla did not blink. Something rare was unfolding, and no one dared to break its spell. Stay tuned. This is only the beginning. The words that changed the room. From the stillness that had gathered after her walk to the podium, her first words seemed to pierce the air, soft yet unshakable. I speak tonight not because I have to, but because I want to. No ornate greeting, no ceremonial introduction, just a sentence stripped to its core, spoken with the kind of sincerity that drew every ear closer. In a hall accustomed to speeches layered in protocol, the simplicity was almost jarring. The chandeliers cast a warmer glow, as if the room itself had leaned in to listen. She didn't stand there as a princess, ticking off prepared talking points. Instead, she spoke with the ease of someone who had carried these thoughts for a long time. Her stories came without preamble, short, vivid portraits of lives most in that ballroom would never encounter. A boy who found comfort in a coat 2 sizes too big, sleeves swallowing his thin hands. A girl who slipped through busy streets each day unseen, her existence barely registering to those rushing past. A child who had never owned a book, another who had never known the weight of a comforting embrace. Her voice was steady, never faltering, but beneath it ran an undercurrent of urgency. Each example was more than an anecdote. It was a quiet challenge, an unspoken question hanging in the air. What will you do with what you've been given? This isn't about the size of your donation, she said, her tone deepening just enough to carry over the breathless silence. It's about showing up, sitting with someone when the world has told them they don't matter, and proving them wrong just by being there. No one shifted in their seats. Even the most seasoned guests, used to the measured rhythm of formal addresses, seemed momentarily disarmed. Some leaned forward, elbows resting on linen-draped tables. Others clasped their hands tighter, as though anchoring themselves in the moment. She moved her gaze deliberately across the hall, lingering on each corner. Diplomats in tailored suits, philanthropists wearing the practiced smile of the well-connected, journalists with pens poised mid-air. They all felt her eyes rest on them, if only for a breath. There was no accusation there, only a quiet insistence that the responsibility for kindness was shared. Kindness, she continued, her voice unwavering, is not charity. It's justice, and everyone deserves that. The sentence hung in the air like a bell's final note, and in its brief silence, all eyes instinctively sought Queen Camilla. Her expression didn't crack, but her fingers curled more tightly around the stem of her glass. Whether it was discomfort or reflection, no one could tell. Charlotte didn't rush to finish. She allowed her pauses to work like punctuation, moments for the audience to feel the weight of what had been said before she carried them forward again. It wasn't the pace of someone unsure, it was the pace of someone making sure she was heard. She thanked the charities in the room, not for their prestige or the scale of their work, but for the quiet moments no press release would ever capture. The late nights, the difficult conversations, the persistence in the face of indifference. She didn't simply praise their service, she aligned herself with it. Then, without raising her voice, she made a promise to speak for those who could not, and to invite everyone listening to do the same, not out of duty, but by choice. Her words were steady, yet they carried the quiet weight of conviction, the kind that lingers long after the applause fades. The ballroom stayed hushed, broken only by the faint click of camera shutters chasing what could never be fully captured. What began as an unplanned addition to the evening had quietly grown into something unforgettable, a moment that pressed itself into memory and refused to let go. To truly grasp the force behind her words tonight, we must step back into the world that shaped her. Charlotte's life behind palace walls. From her earliest days, Princess Charlotte was not simply raised beneath the weight of a crown, but within the quiet discipline of a family determined to blend tradition with truth. While the public often saw only smiles from palace balconies or fleeting moments at official events, her real education happened in places without cameras, charity kitchens, children's wards, and windswept fields where saplings were planted in the cold. William and Catherine were deliberate in their approach. They wanted their children to know not only the rituals of state, but the pulse of the people they might one day lead. They encouraged questions, real, sometimes difficult questions, about the world. Charlotte learned early that being royal meant more than wearing a sash. It meant standing beside those who had been forgotten. On visits to hospitals, she would kneel so her eyes met those in wheelchairs. In community gardens, she would slip off her gloves to feel the soil, asking how the plants would survive winter. At home, the rhythm was a mix of structure and warmth. Evenings might end with Charlotte reading aloud to George and Louis, her voice carrying the same careful cadence she would later use in public speeches. She learned patience by helping her youngest brother through the parts of royal life that made him restless. Catherine encouraged her to make choices and hold her ground, while William often guided her quietly, leaning down during official events to murmur words meant only for her. But perhaps the most profound influence came from the stories she absorbed. She read letters sent to the family, some recounting lives transformed by her grandmother Diana's compassion. She overheard her parents speaking softly about how influence should never be hoarded, but spent in service. When she asked about sorrow or duty, she was met not with deflection, but with honesty, sometimes softened, but never disguised. There was one afternoon in 2023 at a children's hospice that stayed with her. A young girl pressed a handmade bracelet into her palm and whispered something so tender that it made Catherine's eyes glisten. Charlotte said nothing in reply. simply knelt and embraced the girl with a stillness that carried more meaning than words could. No headlines followed, but it became one of those moments that lived quietly in her memory, waiting for a stage where it might shape her actions. Years of these small, unpublicized experiences were what stood behind her when she finally stepped to the podium at the gala. She wasn't there because the schedule required her. She was there because she understood, deep down, the weight of speaking when it mattered. Every pause, every measured glance across the audience carried the imprint of a childhood where kindness was not an act to be performed, but a habit to be lived. Charlotte hadn't been thrust into the spotlight. She had been allowed to grow toward it, steadily, intentionally, until she could stand there, not as a symbol polished for ceremony, but as a young woman shaped by moments most people never saw. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't the title before her name that gave her authority. It was the years of listening, learning, and quietly standing beside those whose voices the world had overlooked. And as the final note of applause from Charlotte's words still trembled in the air, a subtle but undeniable change took place at the royal table. A queen's unscripted moment. Queen Camilla's gaze, fixed and unwavering, traced every syllable that left Charlotte's lips. At first, her face held the gracious stillness expected of a monarch, a faint smile, shoulders set just so, hands resting with precision. Yet somewhere between the measured cadences and the unflinching conviction of the young princess's voice, a ripple disturbed that surface. It began with a single line, spoken with disarming calm. Kindness is not charity, it is fairness. Camilla's hand moved almost absently toward her wine glass, but stopped short, fingertips resting lightly against the stem. Her smile did not fade, yet something taut settled in her jaw. She blinked slowly, as if buying herself the space to absorb what had just been said. It was not defiance she felt, nor offense. Rather, the kind of sudden reckoning that comes when truth arrives without warning and refuses to leave. A discreet shuffle from an aide drew briefly at her attention, but with the smallest raise of her palm, she waved him away. Her eyes did not leave the stage. Across from her, King Charles leaned forward, his hands folding together, his expression unreadable but intent. He had heard countless speeches in his life, yet there was a certain weight in this one, a weight that did not rest on formality or ornament, but on an unvarnished sincerity that seemed to slip past the defenses of even the most seasoned listener. When Charlotte spoke of the unseen, the people who stand among us yet remain overlooked, Camilla's shoulders shifted ever so slightly, the motion small enough to go unnoticed by most. Her bracelet gave a soft chime against the table, an unplanned punctuation to the young princess's words. And as applause began to rise from the hall, she remained still, her hands lightly gripping the edge of the table as though anchoring herself. Charles was the first to stand, his slow, deliberate clapping carrying more than ceremony. Camilla followed a moment later, each movement measured, her expression touched not by disapproval or praise, but something quieter, more private, a contemplation that seemed to linger in her eyes even after she sat again. The voice of a new generation, one that changed the room. From the moment the last clap faded into the soft rustle of gowns and the low hum of whispered conversations, something unspoken seemed to settle over the hall. Princess Charlotte had not merely addressed an audience, she had unsettled an entire tradition. Her words, unpolished yet deliberate, carried none of the rehearsed polish expected of royal speeches. Instead, they bore the weight of someone who had seen enough of the world to understand both its gentleness and its cruelty. This was not the kind of evening where a young princess was expected to break from the palace's careful script, yet Charlotte had done just that, her steady tone free of fear, her eyes meeting the gaze of strangers and sovereigns alike. It was not rebellion, it was authenticity, and that in a place built on protocol was far more disruptive. For decades, the monarchy had guarded itself behind formality. Polished statements, rehearsed smiles, and distance had been the currency of its image. But Charlotte's words slipped past all that, pulling at something older, something more human. She did not speak of policy or duty. She spoke of people, those overlooked, those unheard. And she spoke as if she had stood among them. Those listening could imagine her in hospital corridors, kneeling to meet a child's eyes, or pausing to listen when others turned away. In the corridors of the palace, aides exchanged quiet looks. Some were stirred, even proud, while others bristled at the breach in tradition. If a royal child could speak with such independence, where would the lines be drawn? Yet outside those walls, the reaction was immediate and unwavering. Classrooms replayed her speech. Social media lit up with her words. People were not praising her because she was a princess. They were praising her because she had made them feel something rare, that the monarchy could still listen. It wasn't the size of Charlotte's platform that made the night unforgettable, but the depth of her sincerity. In just one speech, she proved leadership isn't inherited, it's earned. Long after her final words, the room still felt charged, her message spilling into streets, pubs, and trains. It was a moment too powerful to stay contained. Keep watching. What happened next will surprise you. The ripple that reached beyond the room. By the time morning light spilled across London, her words had already traveled farther than she ever imagined. They looped endlessly on news broadcasts, filled headlines in multiple languages, and spread through phones with the quiet urgency of something people felt they had to share. In that footage, Charlotte, in a deep blue gown, posture steady, voice unwavering, there was no grand performance, only a truth that seemed to pierce through formality. Commentators, columnists, and television hosts picked apart every detail, from the gentleness in her tone to the fleeting glance she gave Queen Camilla. Some saw it as a calculated move, others as the unfiltered bravery of youth. But what no one disputed was the impact. This was not a ceremonial appearance dressed up for public admiration. It was a moment that carried weight because it came without pretense. Across the United Kingdom, conversations unfolded in unexpected places. Teachers printed out her words for students to discuss. Hospital staff spoke about her empathy in break rooms. Community leaders saw an overnight surge in donations to causes she mentioned. A grainy clip taken from the front row showed a woman silently crying as Charlotte spoke about those often forgotten. Later, she revealed herself as someone who had once lived without a home. Her letter to the palace, shared anonymously weeks later, only deepened the public's connection to the young princess. Online, speculation swelled. Would she speak again soon? Was this a shift in how the monarchy would engage with its people? Theories bloomed in comment sections and royal forums, dissecting her body language, her pauses, even the choice of her words. Yet beneath all the noise, the essence of the moment remained clear. She had spoken not to charm, but to champion. Inside palace walls, there was no rush to respond. William and Catherine offered no press statements, allowing the moment to stand on its own. They understood what many in the public had already sensed. Her voice didn't need permission to matter. And as the echoes of that evening continued to roll outward, crossing borders and languages, it became evident this was no fleeting spark. It was a wave that would keep moving, quietly altering the shorelines it touched. When the old walls breathed. For centuries, royal life has moved to a rhythm older than memory can recall. Every movement measured, every word weighed, every expression shaped by traditions that have guarded the crown from the shifting winds of public opinion. It is a rhythm that protects, but also confines. Yet that evening, Charlotte stepped into that ancient choreography and, with a grace that felt both instinctive and deliberate, shifted its tempo. She had not broken the rules. She had allowed them to bend, like candlelight flickering in an old hall, illuminating corners long left in shadow. In the monarchy's unwritten code, children are present but rarely heard. They wave, they smile, they observe. Their voices, if ever made public, are scripted, polished, and approved by unseen hands. But Charlotte's words that night had arrived without ceremony or announcement. No carefully timed press release, no meticulously rehearsed delivery. Her speech carried no fingerprints but her own. Behind palace doors, the reaction was as divided as it was intense. Some senior aides recognized the significance immediately, describing it as a quiet but undeniable turning point. Others exchanged worried glances, questioning whether the unpredictability of authenticity could unsettle the careful balance of royal presentation. Whispers traveled quickly. Had she been coached, Or was this entirely her doing? Did the Queen's composed expression mask disapproval? Or was it pride restrained by decorum? But history has shown that the crown survives not by resisting change, but by absorbing it. Monarchs before her had navigated wars, abdications, revolutions, and scandal, not through defiance of tradition, but through its careful evolution. Charlotte's presence at that podium was part of that long, unbroken thread. William and Catherine's vision for their children had always leaned toward openness, raising them to understand that privilege without purpose is an empty inheritance. And that night, their daughter's voice seemed to embody that belief, measured yet unafraid, respectful yet unbound by rote performance. In the days that followed, senior advisors began sketching new strategies, not to quiet her voice, but to protect it from the constant pull of public demand. The question was no longer if she would speak again, but when, and on whose terms. Something in her words that night had drifted through the palace like a sudden change in the wind, carrying the unmistakable scent of what was to come. The ripples did not fade with the gala's final bow. They swelled, moving far, beyond gilded ceilings and polished marble toward something far less predictable. Keep watching. This isn't over. The enduring legacy of a courageous princess. In the days after, Kensington Palace became the unlikely keeper of hundreds of letters. They came from schoolchildren who saw themselves in her, from nurses who had watched her speech during night shifts, from charity workers who had long fought for causes she named aloud. Some included drawings, others handwritten pages trembling with gratitude, not to a princess, but to a girl who had made them feel noticed. Inside the palace, Charlotte returned quietly to her daily rhythm, lessons by the window's soft light, small adventures in the gardens with her brothers, evenings curled beside Catherine with a book. Yet there was a subtle shift in her presence. Her questions at the dinner table grew sharper, her pauses before speaking longer. She carried herself with the steady calm of someone who had tested their strength in the open and found it held. William watched her with the quiet understanding of a father who knew the cost of stepping forward. One evening, he told her that true leadership was not about being heard, but about knowing when your words could serve others. She listened intently, her gaze thoughtful, as though weighing the truth against her own experience. Though the headlines soon turned to other royal affairs, the public memory did not dim. Invitations began to arrive for youth forums, art projects, and charity events centered on children's welfare. She was never pushed into them. She chose when to appear, and when she did, it was never for ceremony's sake. She moved through each moment with a purpose too deliberate to be rehearsed, as though carrying forward not just her own voice, but the voices of those who had trusted her with theirs. So what do you think? Could Charlotte's emerging voice truly shape a monarchy that listens, feels, and leads with heart? We'd like to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe.